Introducing our lovely speakers. So we have the team from the University of the West of England, Professor Steve Poole and Dr. Roger Ball. Steve Poole is Professor of History and Heritage and Director of the Regional History Centre at the University of the West of England, and is currently leading the 3-year research project Intergroup Dynamics in the 1831 Reform Riots towards a new social psychohistory, which this talk is part of, I believe. Steve works and publishes broadly on 18th and 19th century English history from below, as he puts it, with an emphasis on crime, protest and the crowd in south-western counties. Dr. Roger Ball, who will be talking towards the end of the talk, talking about the psychology elements, was an aerospace engineer for 25 years and then transitioned into history, where he completed a PhD at the University of West England, part-time, he likes to point out that everyone can do it, and got interested in riots, studying the 2011 riots, which brings the 18th and 19th century history into the contemporary view, and I'll leave it to them.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Yes, as John quite rightly says, this talk arises out of a wider project into intergroup dynamics in the 1831 Reform riots. Just very briefly, what we're doing is we're putting a bunch of historians in a room with some social scientists and finding out what we can learn from one another about the historic ways in which crowds used to form, or the way that crowds behaved, the way that the authorities have behaved towards crowds, and comparing that with what happens in the present. So we're using some sort of modern theories of crowd behaviour and applying them backwards to the 1830s to see what happens. So we're working on that with Professor John Drury at the University of Sussex in particular. Right, so I'm going to so here's a plan. I've got a plan. That's good, isn't it? I've got a plan. This is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about the Yeovil Reform riots. Of course, that's why you've come. But in order to understand the Yeovil Reform riots, we think you need to know a little bit about what was going on in the country at the time, what's happening elsewhere. So we're going to have a look at, these are reform riots. They're about the reform of Parliament. So we're going to look at just how the unreformed Parliament worked in terms of voting rights. We're going to have a look at what was going on locally, what the local aspect of that was, and that means us taking a look at the 1831 by-election in Dorset. I'll explain that in a bit. Then we'll have a think about Yeovil itself. What kind of a town was Yeovil in 1831? Was it a happy town? Was it not such a happy town? What was its demeanour? And then we're going to have a close look at the rioters. Who are the people who are rioting in Yeovil in 1831? What do we know about them? Is it just the mob, or is it something a bit more complex than that? All right, so let's start with the unreformed electorate, as we call them, that is. Who could vote in Britain in 1831? And there's a nice, in case you don't know what England looks like, there it is, England and Wales on a nice old contemporary map. And so, well, the population of England and Wales in 1831 is round about 14 million people, round about. And so you think, well, how many of those people could vote in a parliamentary election? And the answer is around about 344,000. So the first thing you think is, well, that's not very many, is it? And that's bad, and surely more people should be voting than that in 1831. That doesn't seem quite right. So we might need to reform that. But it's worse. It's not just the number, it's the dispersal of votes. There is no uniform qualification to vote. I'll qualify that slightly. Every county in the country is entitled to return 2 members of Parliament, and there is a uniform qualification for voting for the county members, and that is, if you are a 40-shilling freeholder, then you can vote for county members. If you're in control of a freehold property worth 40 shillings or more per year, then you have the right to vote in the counties. But what upsets all that is that in the towns, some of which were chartered boroughs, all sorts of other voting qualifications kicked in, which may or may not allow more or less people to vote in any one county. So, for example, let's look at Bristol, a big place. 1831, the population of Bristol is round about 100,000 people. So how many people do we think should probably be able to vote in a city the size of Bristol? And the answer is about 5,600. Not terribly many. But then let me tell you, that's one of the widest franchises in unreformed England in 1831. Bristol had it really good. If you're in Bristol, you thought, right, yes, I could aspire to vote there. But it's not too many, is it? Bristol returned 2 members of Parliament and only 5,600 people could vote. Bath, on the other hand, now Bath is one of Europe's fastest growing spa towns, perhaps the fastest growing spa town in Europe, and its population is almost half that of Bristol's. It's getting on for 50,000 by 1831. So we can do a quick calculation here. If all things are equal, we should be able to work out that if that's 5,600 people can vote in Bristol, we should be able to work out how many people can vote in Bath. Should be about half that, right? But the answer is 30 people could vote in Bath, which is a bit shocking, and even more shocking when you learn that the 30 people who were allowed to vote in Bath were simply the members of the unaccountable and unelected corporation, that is the council who ran the affairs of the city. And when one of them died, they just invite someone else to take over. There was never any accountability, no voting for the council. But those 30 people elected 2 people to Parliament every time there was a general election. So it's not just the numbers aren't very big, it's that the spread of who can vote, the dispersal of votes is pretty weird. If you get beyond Bath and Bristol and start thinking about, what about the big growing industrial towns of the north? Because everybody's shifting from the south to the north. All the money's in the north and the Midlands, right? It's the Industrial Revolution. Let's get up there. And so Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Yeovil. There's jobs in Yeovil, right? I'm just trying to keep it local. So how many people do you think can vote up there? Answer, none. No, these were all places that did not have a borough charter. There was no voting, except for the county, right? So, but the towns, no voting. So clearly things weren't very, very fair. One of the things I suppose people say, well, why did it all come to a head in 1830, 1831? What's so special about that? Nothing particularly special about that. It's just that it's going to come to a head eventually as the industrial towns grow in population, as the self-will, if you like, the confidence of the new economic social middle class sort of gets up out of bed in the morning and goes, why the hell can't I vote? I'm a captain of industry. I run 15 factories. I'm supplying iron to the coal mines and goodness knows what, and I still can't even vote. It's going to come to a head eventually. So what we might call the growing divide between the south and the north is a factor. So in this period, 1830 to 1831, we might want to think about what's going on in the background then that speeds the delivery of a programme of radical reform. So in 1830, the government is run by the Tories and the Prime Minister is the Duke of Wellington. The Duke of Wellington, the hero of Waterloo and all that. But he runs a government which is staunchly opposed to political reform, to parliamentary reform. They are absolutely opposed to it. So opposing him in the country, by January of 1831, we start to see of 1830, we start to see the formation of things called political unions. Political unions are campaigning organisations, societies of ordinary people clubbing together to fight for, to protest against the old corruption, as they see it, of the electoral system. So we start to see sort of grassroots campaigning taking place, and then people they look across the Channel in May in France, and what happens there? They have a revolution, the second of 4 French revolutions, I think we can say, it's one of those. It is a kind of a meritocratic revolution. It's the doing away with the old unpopular Bourbon dynasty, placed on the throne, returned to the throne by the victorious European allies at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and the replacement of the Bourbon dynasty in France with what people sometimes refer to as a bourgeois monarchy, a sort of a middle-class monarchy, a no-nonsense monarchy, a monarchy for the people. Louis Philippe is the monarch concerned, and he likes to express his middle-class values by marching around in the centre of Paris in a top hat and tails and swinging an umbrella. It's a way of indicating that you're not all done up in ermine and everything else like a British king might. But here's the thing. Just as France has its revolution, our king George IV dies, and he's replaced by William IV, who we see pictured there in resplendent ermine and velvet. But William IV is another king who sees himself, likes to see himself, is happy to be spun, at any rate, as a man of the people, as a different sort of monarch, as a bourgeois monarch, if you like, a middle-class monarch, a top hat and tails monarch. And there's an expectation then in the country. We've looked at the French Revolution, we've got our political unions, we've got a new king. Is he going to be a broom that clean sweeps through old corruption and clears it away and brings in a better tomorrow? Is he Reform Bill? You know. Oh, you laughed at that. They didn't this morning. Anyway, you're bright. Okay, that's really good. Anyway, following the coronation, there's an election. The Tories find themselves weakened. There is clearly reform in the air. There's a will to reform in the air. They're weakened as a result. They're not thrown out, but there are far more Whig members than there had been previously. And then one of the first things they have to deal with from the summer on into the winter, the captain swing agricultural riots. So we've got agricultural labourers, normally expected to be the most deferential of workers, tugging their forelocks and welcoming the squire. Instead, burning threshing machines, setting fire to haystacks, demanding better conditions of service at work and better wages. And this is a long and protracted campaign by agricultural workers, which I think just exposes how fragile the state was starting to look. It wasn't easy to work out how to deal with it. And again, just the sense that there is, that change is becoming inevitable. In November of 1830, Wellington's government finally fell. The Tories tore themselves apart over Catholic emancipation, is the truth of it. But as a result of it falling, the King appoints a coalition government between the Whigs and the Tories. So as we enter 1831, the Whigs, first thing they want to do as partners in government is introduce a reform bill. A reform bill which is introduced and then sabotaged by the Tory members who won't have it. This is Lord Grey's reform bill, and what does Lord Grey do? He says, right, that's it, we'll have to have another general election. We are leaving, we're going to go to the country on a mandate for radical reform. So there's an election in April. And this time the Tories are trounced. It's a Whig landslide, and reform is surely what must be delivered next. They deliver a second reform bill. I should just say, the reform bill, the purpose of the reform bill was to, for the first time, give the vote to all men with a property worth £10 a year or more. So the idea was to enfranchise most middle-class men, I suppose, or certainly a good number of middle-class men. Incidentally, the first time that a law was to be passed which explicitly made it impossible for women to vote. Often think about the 1832 Reform Act as a kind of a measure that sped democracy slightly nearer, but actually it was the first time that women were expressly forbidden to vote. It was a masculine franchise from there on. Anyway, I'm diverging from the point. The point is, on the 8th of October, just when the landslide Whig government thought we finally got it through the Commons, no problem there, the Tories are defeated, we'll just push it up to the Lords, and the Lords turn around and say, no, we're not having that, we're not having reform, and they kick it out. So what you have there is a constitutional crisis, because you've got a government that wants reform, you've got a king who is apparently on side for reform, at least people thought that he was, and an intransigent bunch of unelected, unaccountable aristocrats sitting in the House of Lords who take it upon themselves to say no. So we do have a crisis, and people rise up. So on the 8th of October, the very day that it's kicked out, in Derby, there is extensive rioting for reform against the House of Lords. On the 9th of October, the following day, it spreads to Nottingham. This is in fact a picture of Nottingham Castle on fire. 10th of October, it moves to Loughborough and Mansfield. Don't ask me why. It's hard, but it did. And then suddenly we get a little cluster of riots in Dorset, which is slightly surprising. Parkston and Poole on the 11th of October, Blandford on the 15th, Sherborne on the 19th. Goodness me, surely not Sherborne. Well, you know. And then on the 21st of October, Yeovil. And there's one in Bristol, which is like one in Bristol. That's the most serious, is in Bristol, starting on the 29th of October, going on for 2.5 days. And there's another one which I haven't put on here in Worcester on November the 5th. But things are clearly fairly serious. But so we might ask the question, what's that little bundle in Dorset doing? And what's that got to do with Yeovil anyway? Because I thought Yeovil was in Somerset. And so it is. But let's just remember, Somerset itself is a county which has shown a certain amount of interest in reform. There's not a lot of rioting going on in Somerset, but there is some. Bristol's not really in Somerset, but we put it on the picture. Bath did have a riot in support of rioters in Bristol, as it turns out. And you can see Yeovil down the bottom there in red. But also you can see political unions have been springing up, mostly in response to the Lords throwing out of the bill on the 8th. So political unions start to appear, demonstrations of support for reform start to appear. And so Somerset's not entirely quiet, but what we're going to argue here is that the Yeovil riot has much more to do with what's going on in Dorset than what's going on further north in the rest of Somerset. So what is going on in Dorset? What's going on in Dorset is that one of the two county MPs commits suicide, and so they have to have a by-election for one of the two members. And it's a by-election, the polling opens on the 30th of September and it closes on the 17th of October, and the Lords kick the bill out on the 8th. So this is an election which takes place before, during and after the crisis in central government over reform. And so, unsurprisingly, people in the country look to what's going on in Dorset as a sort of this is the reform struggle in microcosm, because there's two candidates. There's a Tory who is opposed to reform, and there's a Whig who is in favour of reform. And surely the result of the election here will be the biggest test of public opinion we've ever seen for the validity of reform. Everyone's eyes are on it. So here is the dashing reformer, William Ponsonby, the Whig, and here is the crusty old Tory, well, you know, but he is, isn't he? That's Lord Ashley, who stood for the Tory anti-reformers. On the 17th of October, the poll is called, and Ashley has won by 36 votes. It's a little close, but it's worse than that. It's understood that he's only won because he's hired goodness knows how many influential lawyers to sit around on the polling field challenging Whig voters as they come in to register their votes for Ponsonby and having them declared invalid. Because there's always business about, if you're a 40-shilling freeholder, right, but you're expected to be able to demonstrate that you are indeed a legitimate 40-shilling freeholder, and a clever lawyer will probably find ways of dismissing your claim. So the argument, I'm sure the Whigs were doing it as well, but the argument is that something like 500 people were disqualified from voting in this election. And it is argued on the reform side, of course, that this is exactly the only reason that Ashley won. As one newspaper put it, he won his election thanks to the trickery of the lawyers and the partiality of the assessors. So let's have a little look at Yeovil now. So what's Yeovil's interest? So the first thing we need to know about Yeovil is, of course, that there will be some people living in this town who are 40-shilling freeholders in Dorset. So although they don't vote in Yeovil for a Yeovil MP, they might well be able to vote for Dorset MPs if they happen to have freehold property just over the border. So there is a kind of a direct political connection. But Yeovil itself has a population of about 5,000 people in 1831. It's a busy town. It's a borough, but it's not a borough with a charter. Well, it has a 13th century charter, but it's not one that empowers it return MPs to Parliament. So it doesn't have MPs, and importantly, it doesn't have a resident magistrate either. So law and order is not the easiest thing to maintain in a place like Yeovil. Resident magistrates are important, and the reason for that is that this is a period before the advent of a professional police force. So no towns, apart from London, which has the Met after 1829, no towns in 1831 have professional police, which means you are rather dependent on the magistracy. The magistrates are the thin blue line that separates the world of chaos from happiness. You know, that's the way they would see it. Like keeping everything on an even keel is a magistrate's job. If you haven't got one who wants to live in a dirty sort of post-industrial town like Yeovil, wasn't post-industrial, but you know, then they want to live in a country seat somewhere outside, then of course they will. So it's one of many towns that don't have a resident magistrate, and that can be a problem. It does have a corporation running its affairs, that is a council of sorts, but they don't have any real powers. They don't really. They have a mayor. He's not called a mayor, he's called a Port Reeve. And a corporation of about 5 burgesses run the affairs of the town, and they have 2 constables, part-time, untrained, annually elected, and 4 watchmen after the 1830 Improvement Act is passed. So that, I mean, and that's not the flying squad, right? That's not going to that's not going to deal with any sort of serious disorder. And when I say the corporation look after the borough in which they reside, and I know for you think borough's just that one street, but that is true. But the borough of Yeovil was wider, so I've put the boundaries of it on the slide here so we can see how much land the corporation were supposedly in charge of. They were quite big property owners inside that blue line, but you can also see that, you know, the newer houses, the smarter houses, the villas that were going up on sort of Henford and Kingston weren't actually even within the purview of the old corporation. So what's been going on? Let's have a look at Somerset as a county then and test the interest we might find here in reform around about 1830, 1831. One thing we can do is look and see how general elections were playing out in the county. Right, so for those county seats, for the seats for the county, the 2 MPs, we can have a look at the way elections are changing. In 1820, there's a general election. 2 Tories are returned. That's not unexpected. 1820, 2 Tories, Thomas Lethbridge and William Dickinson. There's another election in 1830, as I just told you, on the accession of William IV. 1 Whig member finally manages to get on the roll, Edward Sanford, and the Tory William Dickinson. So the Tories have lost 1 seat. A year later, when Lord Grey goes to the country to try to get the Reform Bill through Parliament, this is the pattern that's reflected elsewhere in the country. This is part of the Whig landslide. Somerset is now a fully Whig pro-reform county. So there's clearly an atmosphere favouring reform in the county at large. And in Yeovil itself, here is that victorious Whig MP, Edward Sanford, who presents to Parliament a reform petition from Yeovil in February 1831. And when the Lords kick the Reform Bill out on the 8th of October, there's also a loyal address to the King composed in Yeovil. This is important because the King is seen to be a friend to reform. You know, all these protests, all of these campaigners are campaigning on behalf of government. That's something worth remembering. We're talking about riots here. These are riots in favour of a government measure, not riots opposed, which normally we think today of, you know, protests are usually against the government. The government was trying to get the Reform Act passed. So the King is seen as the friend to that process. And there is a plan from at least the 8th of October for a political union, a pro-reform society to be set up amongst the people of Yeovil as well. So you are a reform town, I would say. Fair to argue. But not necessarily a very happy place. If we're looking for fractures in the social networks of the town, free trade had by this time started to do a fair bit of damage to the glove trade. And as you know, I'm sure, the glove trade was one of the biggest employers in the town. It was associated with glove making, wasn't it? As the chairman of the Committee of Operative Glovers at Yeovil, that is the Glovers Trades Union, put it in 1832, Robert Rolls, "Free trade has plunged one of the happiest and most flourishing neighbourhoods in the empire from a state of competence and prosperity into one of beggary, pauperism and moral degradation." Chiefly the problem was cheap French imports were flooding the market and undermining the wage settlements for Yeovil's own gloving trade. So there's that going on, and the impression that there's a discontent, social discontent in Yeovil, as felt in Dorset, really comes out in this lovely little quotation from the Morning Post, a Tory newspaper from London, commenting on the recent riots in Sherborne. Argues, and this is obviously hyperbole, but anyway, promises of support are held out by the Zummerset Refarmers, as they like to put it. That would have amused the folk in London, I'm sure. From Yeovil, names your town, well done, congratulations, and the neighbourhood, some of whom were conspicuous in the crowd last night, that is in Sherborne, with swords concealed under their coats. I don't know how many of you normally go out to Sherborne with a sword concealed under your coat. But I think the argument here was not that they went out with a sword, it's that they were involved in fighting with the military, with the Yeomanry the night before, and swords were taken as trophies. And it was the Yeovilians who came and took them swords and hid them under their coats. So like, this is the sort of thing, at least one London newspaper thinks that Yeovilians are the kind of troublemakers who will just make things worse in Dorset and probably in Somerset as well. So you have a bit of a reputation by the sound of it there. And it's also pointed out, this is sort of rather more soberly, this is from 1852, the General Board of Health produced a report on the state of sanitation in Yeovil. And again, you can see the way that the disadvantaged areas, as the economy is in a certain decline, the disadvantaged areas are becoming more prone to serious disease and malnutrition, and particularly typhoid. And in the report, it's clear, if you look at I have to come over here to read it, but look at the way in which the argument goes. It often results fatally, typhoid that is, and is generally found in the lower parts of the town, that is, in South Street, Wreckleford, Vicarage Street, Belmont, where it was extreme. So where it was extremely fatal a few years since. Middle Street, Dodham, Adderwell and Gornap. These districts comprise the worst conditioned parts of the town, and there is a marked difference between them and the other parts of the town. I do not recollect to have seen a case of fever of that class in Kingston Street, and very few in Hendford. So the geography of illness, and certainly of typhoid, is actually cut through by social class. So we've just been talking about the absence of resident magistrates and how important they were for keeping law and order. So we might want to know where on earth the bloody magistrates were in that case. One of them was up here. He's John Goodford. He will appear in our story more very soon. From Chiltern, audience participation moments, by the way. I say Cantello. Oh, you laugh. What do you say? Cantello. Bob goes, Cantello, because you're from London, innit? Yeah, all right. Cantello. Hands up for Cantello. Yeah, come on. Yeah. Hands up for Cantello. Oh, all right, it's Cantello. Yeah, I knew that. Anyone for Cantello? A big Italian community. No. All right. So John Goodford from Cantello. Thomas Hoskins from Hazelbury Plucknet. I think I got that one right. So these two are the acting magistrates for the division of Yeovil, and as you can see, they don't live very near it. We've also got this fellow, William Haler from Coker Court. What? Hellier. Didn't I say that? You are a picky lot, aren't you? Blimey. Right.
Charles got booed when he did.
Yes, that's right. John Phillips, got that, from Montacute. Montacute, what? Phillips? Oh, I'm fed up with you lot already. Who is, of course, Lord of the Manor, Lord of the Manor, as well as being an active magistrate. So anyway, the point is, they all live somewhere else, and if they've got to be summoned, they've got to be summoned, and you can't enrol special constables to help you out if you haven't got a magistrate to do it. So that's just worth bearing in mind. So let's turn to the riot itself, shall we? Now, we will have noted already that it's some time since the Lords kicked the Reform Bill out, and some time too since the declaration of the Dorset election that Yeovil riots. It's 2 days after Sherborne and 4 days after Blandford. And you might think, why did it take them so long? Were they taking them a long time to understand what was going on? Had they not received the news? Can't they read the papers or something like that? I think the common denominator is market day. It starts in Yeovil on market day, which is Friday, 21st of October. And it's crowds who are, you can imagine market day, everyone comes into town. Everyone comes in to trade, to talk, to drink coffee, to have a beer. Market day, it's a big weekly event. And on this occasion, they don't go home, they hang around. And after some time, 8:30 in the evening, the crowd moves off to do some damage. They're going to do some damage to people who they associate with Lord Ashley's corrupt electoral victory. I think it's the best way of putting it. So I won't remember all these names unless I look them up on my little list. So let me get my little list. Here we go. Right, so if you can follow on here, I've got little explosions to show you where things happen. So they gather in the borough, the street, the borough, and the market. And the first place they go to is the house of Edwin Newman. Edwin Newman is a lawyer and an agent for Lord Ashley, so he's a perfectly logical target, if you like. What they do and this is in Vicarage Street, as was, and what they do to Edwin Newman is break his windows. And you'll see the pattern that we see over the rest of the night is basically a question of breaking windows. Breaking windows is a key strategic activity for reform rioting crowds in 1831. They break his windows. Then they go to John Greenham's house across the road. John Greenham is a glover. He's a burgess, a capital burgess. I don't know what his politics were, but if you do, you can tell me later. And I don't think they don't do a great deal of damage there. Actually, he only claims £4 of damages for broken windows at the end of the riot. So I don't think they do too much damage to him, but he was nearby, so they have a go at that. Then they go off to Princes Street. On the way, they break a couple of windows in George Rossiter's schoolhouse. And I'm not entirely sure why they break the windows in George Rossiter's schoolhouse, but don't assume there aren't other kind of local disputes being settled in the midst of all this. Go, well, that's just indiscriminate. No, probably not indiscriminate. They don't do anything indiscriminately. You can see that by what else is going on. Nothing is indiscriminate. So I don't know what he had done to upset them, but perhaps there were a couple of young boys in the crowd who had some particular beef with the schoolmaster. I don't know. Anyway, in Princes Street, they attack Edwin Tompkins, a lawyer. Once again, one of Ashley's lawyers, a man who comes out, produces a pistol and threatens to shoot anyone who tries to break into his house. But actually, they're probably not particularly interested in breaking into his house at that moment. So they retire, they move on, and they come to the house of John Ryle Mayo, and they start breaking his windows. And then somebody shouts out, no! He's a reformer. It's his brother you want. No. Oh, yeah. So I've rather cleverly coloured that one in green to show you, you see the colour code here, so they made the mistake, and they stopped what they were doing. So they're not just out to smash stuff up, right? They're not just drunk running around smashing things. There is a method. So from there, They head up Kingston to William Lambert White, a lawyer who was working in the Ashley cause, and break his windows. They go from there to the right Mayo. There he is up by the old turnpike gate. George Mayo. They go from there to Market Street, where John Slade, a pro-Ashley lawyer, gets his windows broken. And for the time being, they stop at Thomas Robbins' house, a lawyer for Lord Ashley, also in Market Street. Let's just pause here for a moment, because up until this point, I think it's important to notice these moments of escalation. Until this point, we've seen mostly window breaking. Window breaking, move on. Window breaking, move on. And the magistrates themselves, who are explaining afterwards what the course of events in Yeovil was, think they understand what the game is. They write to Lord Melbourne, "We think it right to state that the cry used by the mob in the attack and the plunder of the houses was reform, and that the gentlemen whose houses were selected were either professional agents of Lord Ashley in the election of gentlemen who had voted for or promoted his interest." So they understand that it's targeted. But let's stop and have a look at Thomas Robbins for a moment, because things start to get a bit more serious with the attack on Robbins' house. Robbins himself explains it this way. "After demolishing every window, they proceeded to enter the house." That's the first time this has happened. "And destroyed every article of furniture, books, plate, linen, china, wine, spirits, in short, everything the house contained except our clothes." Interesting here too. They're not stealing this stuff. It's not acquisitive. It's not, let's nick all his stuff and flog it somewhere or have it for ourselves. It's destroy it. Destroy this man's property. That's how we punish him. Not content with this, they injured and destroyed every tree and shrub in the garden, and if Mrs. Robbins and myself had not made our escape, I have every reason to believe our lives would have been sacrificed. That's alarmist talk. There's no evidence that anyone was, intending to take anybody's life here. Your Lordship can scarcely form an idea of the scene which now presents itself. So this is a pretty serious attack on a house, isn't it? Picked up by the Taunton Courier rather more imaginatively. "Not a piece of furniture is left in the two parlours. The mantelpieces, fire irons, two bookcases with their contents, a piano, and all the chairs and tables broken to pieces, and a great part of them consumed. The glass and ware in the kitchen were all broken, smaller than the stones in the road. And a cask of gooseberry wine, 8 or 10 dozen bottles of foreign wine, with brandy and spirits, were carried into the garden and consumed, a great part by women," which is regrettable. But also, I think, a little fanciful. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. Once the legal cases begin, there aren't charges for this great expropriation of liquor. So I don't know whether the Taunton Courier is just kind of getting into the mood and making some of this up, or whether all this stuff was taken. But even if it was, this is just liquor which is taken. They could have taken all those other things. They probably get quite a lot of money for the chairs and tables, but no, they prefer to smash them up. And that's, I think, something worth bearing in mind. When they finished at Robbins' house, they go back to Edwin Newman. So this is the only guy who gets his house attacked twice. And they really give it the going over. The other thing, he's the only guy whose office is broken into and some of his papers destroyed. Both what he and the crowd will have known is that in Sherborne and Blandford, one of the things that happened to lawyers who acted for Ashley was that their offices were ransacked and very valuable legal papers were taken out and destroyed. Again, not stolen, no use to the crowd, but how do you hit a lawyer where it hurts? Set fire to his papers. About 11:30, a violent mob came to my house, several hundreds. They broke down and demolished the office window and shutters and got into the house. I requested them to desist. I told them I had a loaded pistol and I would fire on them. I went to the office door and I addressed them. I said, now they'd broken my windows, they'd better be off or I would fire at them. They were at that time in the office endeavouring to break the door and get into the house. Next morning, between 4 and 5, I returned to my house and found my windows, doors, etc. a complete wreck. My office door was so much broken that I was obliged to have a new one fixed at the back of the house. The dining room windows were all broken, the frames and shutters nearly the same. So once again, a sense that the problem is escalating now. The crowd are moving from the simple business of breaking a few windows to entering houses, destroying furniture, and now a lawyer's office and destroying valuable paperwork. Where would it have gone from there? We don't really know. The point is that at this day, just at this point, John Goodford, the magistrate, arrives. It's around about midnight by now. So Newman's house is already a bit of a wreck. But Goodford turns up, incidentally, because his son Henry has just been having a rather sumptuous dinner at Montacute House. And on his way home to the Goodford house, he passes Yeovil and he notes a riot taking place. So when he gets home, he goes, "Oh, Dad, yeah, the other thing is, oh, yeah, there's a riot in Yeovil. Yeah, I didn't do anything. Do you want to go and have a look?" So Goodford gets on his horse and goes, "Oh, yes, better go and have a look at that." So down he goes, and he finds himself outside Newman's house with a crowd smashing stuff up. There's a lot of them, and he knows he's going to have to be smart. I mean, he's going to have to use his skills as a negotiator if he's going to stop them. He notes, "I have no constables, there are no constables here, no one has enrolled any constables, it's too late to try and find any now. I've got no soldiers, I can't use the soldiers, so what am I going to do? I better go and talk to them." So as he said, "I had therefore recourse to remonstrance, and after persevering in the same course for about 2 or 3 hours," that kept him busy, didn't it? "Was enabled to put a stop to these outrages." That's in a letter he sends to the Home Secretary. He elaborates somewhat on that process when he gives evidence in court during the legal cases that follow. "On my addressing them, the noise in the street and house ceased almost immediately." Well, not 3 or 4 hours then. Right, okay.
Yeah, right.
"The rush was so great from the yard and house that they ran away so quickly that my horse was driven over the way. They collected about me and I addressed them, say, 500. I expostulated with them. That'll sort it out. Intimidation was out of the question. I had no force. I said, 'All that are peaceable and loyal subjects, follow me.' And they did so. Clearing Mr. Newman's premises took about a quarter of an hour, not 3 or 4 hours. I addressed them at 2 or 3 other places before I went into the inn yard." He goes to the Mermaid Inn. Whether they all went with him or not, I'm not too sure. But presumably they at least followed him that far. Basically he argues that therefore the riot was more or less over at this stage. The crowd are sort of milling around. He stays the night in the Mermaid to make sure nothing else happens. And in fact, something does. Later that night, there's a crowd gathers. I don't know whether you can see, but I'm about to put an explosion in down there, like a paint splat. That's Henford Manor, the house of the Reverend Thomas Hooper. There is say, well, why did they attack this reverend gentleman? There is a lot of ill feeling towards the clergy because of the way that the Lords Spiritual, the bishops in the House of Lords, all voted, pretty much, nearly all voted against reform when the Lords kicked the bill out. So the clergy are seen to be an anti-reform element. He's also the brother-in-law of Edwin Newman. I don't know whether that made any difference or not. Anyway, so Goodford has to stir himself, go down there, argue with them once again, and get them to disperse, which it appears he is able to do. So he gets some sleep for the night, and until we move to the second day, Saturday the 22nd of October. During the day, magistrates from around the area, 4 or 5 of them, do finally turn up, come down into the town. They go into the Mermaid. It gives them an opportunity to start swearing in special constables in case there's a resumption of rioting. They don't know if there's going to be any further rioting at this stage. They hope not. but they can start to swear in some special constables. A message is sent to the commander of the 3rd Dragoon Guards at Dorchester. These are regular soldiers, battle hardened. Can we have a detachment of them over here, please? I think we're going to need them soon. They'd just served at Blandford, incidentally, where they'd clashed with the crowd. And they're also able to give instructions to the Mudford and Martock groups of yeomanry, semi-professional volunteer soldiers, if you like, usually from the sort of the minor squirearchy and tenant farmers, and one or two sort of the shopocracy, I suppose, in nice military uniforms, but with cutlasses and live rounds if necessary. They can act as proper soldiers. They can be instructed to come in and assemble that evening, just in case there's any further trouble. So it is quiet for most of the day, but the crowd begin to gather again outside the inn during the afternoon. And as they become more rowdy, the JPs exercise caution as best they can. Goodford writes to Lord Melbourne, "For a considerable time the mob contented itself with shouting, parading the town, using expressions of defiance coupled with the word reform." And he goes on, "The magistrates forbore from interfering with the populace in the vain hope that no immediate acts of violence would take place." So there's that. This is the important thing, you're always negotiating, if you're any good as a magistrate, and thinking, is it time to send constables in? But if I do, what will be the consequence? Is it time to send the yeomanry? If I do, what will be the consequence? Will it exacerbate the problem, or will it clear it up? Which will it be? So they tend to play a waiting game as and when they can, and that's what he does here. But at 6:45, roughly, in the evening, the crowd decide to test the water, march away from the Mermaid, back down to Henford Manor, and resume the attack they started on it the night before. So Goodford and Hoskins sally forth, as Goodford says to Melbourne here, attended by a considerable number of well-disposed persons. That is, he took some special constables with him, I think, where the Riot Act was read, and every effort, although they were assailed with stones and sticks, was made to prevail on the populace to disperse. The riot, however, still continued to a more alarming extent, and with the aid of the civil power only, 2 of the rioters were seized and carried into the Mermaid Inn. Now, this is another kind of interesting thing. What happens if they decide to start taking prisoners? Because if you've got people, you've got to do so. You can't just keep saying, "Please go home." "Oh, please don't do that. Please don't hit me on the head anymore." Please. So you take prisoners. But if you're seen taking 2 prisoners into the Mermaid, someone is going to shout out, "He done nothing. Bring him out. Bring out the prisoners. You've got the wrong guy. How dare you? You're subjecting the people to oppression," and so on. So it's a bit of a risk, but that's what they do. They take 2 prisoners into the Mermaid. Oh, and while they're down at Henford Manor, whilst these prisoners are being taken, the other thing the magistrates finally do, or Thomas Hoskins does, is read the Riot Act. First time it's been read. Wasn't read at all the night before. It's extraordinary. The whole night of rioting goes and no one reads the Riot Act because there wasn't a magistrate to read it. But let me just explain why the Riot Act matters. The Riot Act basically does 2 things. First of all, it says that if you fail to disperse within an hour of my reading it aloud, it has to be read aloud so everyone can hear it. It's an order to disperse. If you're still assembled here an hour after I have read the Act, you may be arrested on a charge of capital felony. In other words, what was a misdemeanour, riot, disorderly behaviour, running around breaking a couple of windows and shouting, becomes a capital felony for which you may be hanged. Do you understand the consequences? But you have an hour. No, rather kind of, that's reasonable. You have an hour in which to to disperse before that happens. It doesn't mean you can't be acted against in that hour, but it does mean the capital felony clause doesn't kick in. But the other thing the Riot Act does is indemnify the military should they be called in to disperse after the Riot Act has been read. If the military are called in to disperse the crowd, the military will be indemnified if anybody is seriously injured. or killed as a result of military intervention. So it's quite important to read it. I just love this cartoon; is just so good. In its kind of rather scurrilous. It's called The Law's Delay, or Reading the Riot Act. The magistrate stands in the middle here, having read the Riot Act, and now having to stand there completely powerlessly, looking at his stopwatch to find out when an hour has passed, while the mob just run around pelting him and his constables, because apparently they can't be dispersed by the soldiers. But I mean, it was never anything like as bad as that. They could have been dispersed by the constables straight away if they did that. But it's a sort of an amusing commentary. Anyway, so the prisoners are taken into the Mermaid, and the cry immediately goes up: rescue the prisoners! Bring out the prisoners! So they've got a new cause now. It's not just break the windows of Ashley's lawyers, it's the magistrates have captured 2 of our blokes. Rescue the prisoners was raised through the streets, and a formidable attack was made upon the inn with stones and every sort of menacing expression. And the magistrates have now they can't release the prisoners, right? That would be madness. So we've got to hold on to the prisoners, and we've got to stop them trying to break down the doors of the Mermaid. The magistrates blockade the doors. Meanwhile, the crowd are outside beating against them. A slightly kind of comic incident occurs then when Goodford thinks to himself, I'm going to have to get the Yeomanry. This is getting out of hand. They're going to break in and get the Yeomanry. But that means I've got to come out of the pub into the crowd on my own. So there's this sort of moment when he comes out and they're all going, "Whoa, there he is!" And he goes, "I'm off." And he runs off to get the Yeomanry, and then he can't get back in. Well, eventually he can. They manage to open the doors and get him in. Dodgy moment for him, I think. But anyway, he successfully collects the Yeomanry and brings them back to disperse the crowd, which is where now most of the action takes place. The Yeomanry have already had to endure having mud and sticks and rocks thrown at them as they came into the town to form up. They're not popular. The point about the Yeomanry is, unlike regular soldiers, they're known personally. People know. Some of them it's their employer. They know the local landowners. They know the people that form the Yeomanry, the respectable tenantry, the respectable farmers. So there's kind of animosity built into that relationship. So they're not a popular choice, but in they come, and they are allowed to effect a dispersal. Now, I've rather cheekily used an image here from the Bristol riots, in which the protagonists are the 3rd Dragoon Guards, battle-hardened and extremely tough soldiers. But the principle is the same. The Yeomanry were used to charge the crowd. They charged the crowd several times, using, as we'll see in a minute, the flats of their sabres, apparently. As whether I should be grateful or not to be hit on the head with the flat of a sabre, or have it sliced off with the sharp end, I don't know. But I mean, these horses are big too. It wasn't fun and games. These horses are big and heavy, and if they're charging in a fairly small contained area, as you imagine the area between the market and the Mermaid actually is, you might want to get out of the way, basically. A very considerable time elapsed before the united exertions of both the troops of Yeomanry, could break the assemblage of the populace, says Goodford when he's writing to the Home Secretary afterwards. So this was a protracted fight. It didn't just happen and stop. This was a very considerable time elapsed. People, therefore, stood their ground and fought back, I think, without a doubt. The Yeomanry were contested. Here's John Phillips. I say, whatever. Here's the man who lived at Montacute. There had been a severe contest, he wrote to the Home Secretary. The 2 troops, Mudford and Martock, were obliged to fire a few pistol shots to clear the mob behind the standings in the marketplace, but no report has been received of any lives being lost. The Yeomanry only used the flat sides of their swords, that's nice, but they charged them several times in the streets. The mob attempted to rescue the prisoners, but were soundly thrashed by the Yeomanry. There is a question here, isn't there, over whether it says, I haven't heard of anybody losing their lives. Well, you might not have heard of anybody losing their lives, and we don't know that anybody lost their lives, but it is quite possible, of course, in situations like this, to have been run into by a horse, crushed perhaps by a horse, but perhaps severely wounded by a wildly flailing sabre. and then to go home and die 3 weeks later from internal injuries. I mean, one doesn't know, but we do know that happened at Peterloo. So it wouldn't be entirely surprising. We don't really know. People who've been involved in a riot and have got hurt, damaged, wounded, aren't going to turn up at the infirmary the following morning and say, oh, I've got this terrible sabre cut here on my arm, because someone's going to arrest them at that point and put them on trial for riot. So these things are quite difficult to measure. Right. Oh yes, and it's just another. It's a nice kind of bit of colouring, I suppose, around that sort of advance of the military and the impact that they have upon the crowd. This is a man called John Saint, who was arrested later and taken to court for attacking the Yeomanry, for fighting with the Yeomanry. One of the people accused of battling the Yeomanry, and he appealed against his sentence by writing this rather fine petition here, produced a petition, multiply signed. He only got a year in prison, so I don't think it was making quite such a fuss about. But his argument was he hadn't been fighting the Yeomanry; they had been fighting him. He says here, it's well known he had no concern whatever with the riots, but at the time he was, to say the least of it, unceremoniously accosted by the Yeomanry. He was just coming into the town from his work and being somewhat elevated with liquor. He said, that's all right, he's finished work for the day. He certainly made use of language which at another time he would not have done. So what he said to the Yeomanry we don't know, but they went for him. That's the point, isn't it? But the confinement he has had since October last will no doubt operate as a caution to him to be more guarded in future. He was banged up in prison awaiting trial for quite some time. So you can see how, once the Yeomanry are introduced, there is all sorts of chaos to try to unravel in terms of what actually happened. I'm just going to skip that bit, I think. One of the things that are important afterwards is the way in which different people try to understand what happened. Because the rioting is over now. The 3rd Dragoon Guards turn up, but it's all over by the time they arrive. But the magistrates and other interested parties are trying to sort of summarise in their minds what has just happened. And here is John Goodford writing to Lord Melbourne, the Home Secretary, in which he says, the different rallying cries used and the general conduct of the mob leads to the conviction that the riot and spoliation of property were the result of a preconcerted plan. Although reform was at first the watchword and the attack was primarily directed against the property of individuals known or supposed to entertain notions in any degree hostile to that measure, we are of the opinion that it is not the ebullition of a mere political feeling, but that the agents of the last winter's outrages are again at work, and that secret, if not open, destruction of property will be resorted to. In other words, he's quite happy. Yeah, they go on about the Reform Act. It's not what it's about. This is the discontented working class who set fire to haystacks last winter. The swing rioters, the reform rioters, they're all the same people. And they will be after your property, and they will set fire to your property and your house and your... he's just got this... Anyway, Goodford is the man who raised the Mudford Yeomanry. I mean, they were his creation. And he was an active... anti-swing magistrate sort of 6 or 7 months earlier. Of course, the Yeomanry are well rewarded for their activity. I can tell you, by the way, I know you know about these, right? These are the Yeovil Reform jugs. There's one on the middle floor of this library on show as I speak. You can go and see it anytime you like. It was put there especially for you to see. But these were given as gifts to all the members of the Mudford Yeomanry for the sterling work they'd done in suppressing riot. Each one engraved, presented by the inhabitants of Yeovil and its vicinity in testimony of their approval of the conduct of the Mudford troop of Yeomanry Cavalry during the riots in that town in 1831. Each one then 2, and then the person's name is engraved after it. What do the people do? How do they move on after the riots? They do indeed set up a political union. A political union which is interfered with constantly by the magistrates. They threaten the innkeeper who allows the first meeting to take place on his premises, and tell him that it's an illegal meeting and it should be closed down and he mustn't hold any more. They return fire by saying, no, these are perfectly legally constituted meetings. But they set themselves up very, you know exactly where they stand when they say the purpose of the Yeovil Political Union is to help to overthrow a vile oligarchy that has long existed in violation and defiance of reason, truth and justice, and which has brought our once happy native land into the fatal jeopardy which now entangles it. So they were quite clear about that. And after the 1832 Reform Act was finally passed, they became an unequivocal universal suffragist organisation. They were quite clear, as far as they were concerned, the Reform Act can be supported, but it's not enough. We now want a vote for all men over the age of 21, regardless of where they live or how much property they hold. We're back to basics. Universal manhood suffrage is where we are. Okay, we don't need to have a look at that, I don't think. I'm going to hand over to Roger, who's going to say a little bit about what we know about the rioters.
Yeah, because we're doing history from below. Let's look from below. So we need to know something about the crowds that took part in the action in Yeovil. So the first place we start normally is with arrestees. The reason for that is it's very hard to find the names of people in general in the crowd. And you could think, well, okay, let's look at what the newspapers say about the crowd. How do they describe the crowd? Well, if you actually look at the newspapers, I'm fairly sick of it now, to be honest, but I've been running the newspapers the last 2 years, and there are numerous derogatory words used for working class crowds. Okay, idle and ruffians, thieves, beggars, and so you'll find loads of those words describe that. In terms of talking about respectable people, you will hear respectable, and that's about it. So the trouble is if you're looking through the newspapers, you're really getting a perspective which is very derogatory to working class crowds, and you can't tell a lot. And in fact, they also often say things like, it was just a load of women and boys, to try and denigrate the crowd. So that kind of sexist approach is also present very much in the 1830s. So what the question is, how do we actually find that a bit more concrete than a load of words from a load of biased journalists, let's say. And one way of doing it is to look at who got arrested. So I've got a sample here of 17 people. Have you got the thingy, Steve?
Sorry.
So you can't see this, so I've got a summary in a minute, but just to give you an idea, so we've got 17 arrestees. That's not a bad sample, actually. I mean, I think in Sherborne we had about 12 and Blandford 15, maybe. But so it is interesting to see who they are. And just to pick a few things out, I mean, what's really great at the moment, and this kind of work is open to you as well, and there's a lot of it to be done. But we've got these great tools like Ancestry.com and Find My Past. So I can't say I was into family history at all until about a year ago. But you can use these tools to really open up. The sources are available online, and you can find quite a bit of information about people, which would have been a lot harder in the past. So I don't use it as a tool to find out about my family. I'm not particularly interested. But what I am interested in is who were these groups of people, and let's filling in some of these things. So you can see the kind of information here is, where were they born? What's their hometown at the time they were arrested? Their ages, occupations, did they own businesses? Did they have the vote? What's their marital status? Were they literate? What did they do in the riot? And you can find that kind of information and other information about networking. I mean, I've got to say that working on Sherborne was a lot easier than Yeovil for a number of reasons. But just to give you an idea, and one of the things we're really interested in here, what I've marked up here is those that were given a capital sentence, a death sentence, which was commuted. So we've got 4 here, and I'll just pick some examples out that people are quite interesting. So we've got this guy, Thomas Symes. He was born in Wayford in Somerset, lived in Yeovil, 25 years old, a mason. He was single at the time. He apparently could read and write. He'd had a previous criminal activity here of he'd been involved in breaking, entering and stealing 30 silver spoons, which is very serious, but I don't know quite what the outcome of that was. He'd been imprisoned. And we might look at Elizabeth Hodges, one woman, very unusual arrestee. So Elizabeth Hodges here from West Camel in Somerset. She was a glover, obviously a lot of people involved in the gloving trade. And she was in prison for a month. We found out her father was a shoemaker. But I won't go too much details. One more here that's interesting. Edward Dodge from Shaftesbury, he was born in Shaftesbury, a leather parer. He was married with 2 kids, apparently could read and write, though we might question that. And he'd been arrested for stealing poultry in 1829. He got 9 months in prison and been whipped. But either his mother or his sister was also arrested at the same time for having in her possession a hen, which was obviously one of the poultry he'd stolen. And they did her for receiving stolen goods, but no fun for her, because she got 4 weeks solitary and 8 months imprisonment. So it was a pretty draconian regime in terms of the law, very draconian regime in terms of the law, especially property law. What's interesting about these, we'll come on to in a minute, is why so few of them actually have criminal records. It's quite interesting. Anyway, let's say something about the rioters. This is a summary of those 17 people. So 16 men and 1 woman. So let's look at their occupations. Well, basically we've got artisans and labourers. That's what we've got here. So these artisans are dyers, glovers, leather workers, masons, a cook, shoemaker, a blacksmith, and a candlestick maker. So it's kind of, if you know what I mean. Labourers and sawyers, 5, and hawkers, 2, and 1 we don't know their occupation yet. But the point about that is in this sample, although it's a small sample, we're finding working class people of 2 skilled and unskilled sections of working class. That's what we're finding in the crowd. That's very similar to Sherborne, very similar to Blandford as well. This is not a middle class reforming crowd that's gone to a political meeting about reform and decided to go out and riot. That's not what's happening. This is a different group of people, much more defined on the lines of the social class that Steve was talking about, that appeared in Yeovil, say around health, housing and wages. So that's our crowd, that's who they are, their ages. Their average age was 26 years, there's quite a big range here, 15, the apprentices up to 36. Actually a slightly older crowd than we found in other places, so a lot of people in their mid-20s. This is very normal. So who did the writing in Yeovil? It's the people from Sherborne. And Sherborne, they say, who did the writing? That's people from Yeovil. Everybody says it's somewhere else. It's somebody else who did the writing from somewhere else. It's very normal with riots to say that, and it's usually absolutely wrong. So of these 17 people, well, 15 of them were living in Yeovil, right? So it's a Yeovil, they're Yeovil rioters, right? They're not from somewhere else. We've got an Irishman, so it's not the Irish, you know what I mean? Because you blame them usually. And actually, what's interesting though is only 4 out of the 17 actually came from Yeovil, were born in Yeovil, which tells you more about the migration of people, because the 13 of them came from Somerset or Dorset, so this is about people moving to Yeovil to work. So that crowd are not predominantly born in Yeovil, but they are people who have moved to Yeovil for work, or their families have in the past. So we got, so these are the foreigners, 1 Irishman, somebody from Cornwall. So it's a Yeovil riot, a Yeovil people's riot. They were older, so most of them were married with children. Most of them were married and most of them had children. And we forget, obviously in those days, an adult began at when you started to work, maybe at 12 or something. Previous criminal record, really important this. Yes, they did. There were 3 out of 17 so far that we found. So interestingly, most people didn't appear to have a serious criminal record. That's interesting. Finally, were they literate? Well, according to the prison registers, the prison register claims that most, or a significant number, could read and write or read. Though I find that questionable. We don't think they actually tested it. So if you were in prison and they said, "Could you read and write?" you'd probably say, "Yeah, without." So I would suggest it's low. Though actually literacy in Dorset and Somerset was quite high relative to the rest of the population. And none of them had the vote, as far as we know. We're finishing here. I was hoping to have a quick few questions, but what this slide is about, from the evidence that Steve's provided and our evidence about the rioters that you've just seen, we can dispel some common myths about riots. So whenever a riot happens, if you look in the media, listen to the news on television, you'll get certain ideas propagated. Now those ideas, and after the riots in 2011, there was a load of survey work done on focus groups of people asking about their conceptions about how crowds operated and what riots are about. And what we found was, or a study found, was that most people still carry ideas about rioting and about crowds that are from the 19th century. They've come from a bunch of French sociologists who basically made it up. Okay, so these are things like, if you've heard these words, carried away by the crowd. Okay, I lost my mind. I didn't know what I was doing, and it was chaos. It was feral. It was insane. It was just random. They were burning everything. They set the city on fire. All of these words are not really the case. And the empirical work that's been done over the last 40 years has started to demonstrate all of these problems with those kind of concepts. So just quickly, the first one is, it was like a tinderbox. Any spark could have caused a riot. Well, that's really not the case. So what you'll find instead is that there are a series of conditions. Rioting is very rare. So for riots to happen, a series of things have to happen and they have to be in place for those things to happen. And there are several levels. So we might say a sort of big background level. And we did a survey, we did statistical surveys in London around the 2011 riots. And I can tell you now that your chances of rioting in London were very much to do with whether you lived in a deprived area or not in a deprived area. And that seems obvious to me. And it is obvious to most people. I mean, they weren't, necessarily rioting in Kensington, but they were rioting in Tottenham. And so, if we looked at the conditions in 1831, as Steve has been talking about, the social conditions, the social class conditions of the people who were rioting are significantly different to the people who are not rioting. Okay, so that's the first thing you might say. That doesn't mean there'll be a riot because you've got deprivation. It just means you have to have that in place for a potential for a riot to happen. The meso level, the sort of middle level, you could argue in this case was probably the idea, the perception of reform amongst many people, that the idea that their lives were going to change because of reform. So they may have had quite different ideas, these people who were rioting about reform, what it meant, to people who were Whigs in government, who had a quite different conception about what was going to happen. So that perception was there. There was a perception, certainly been around for a good couple of years, that something was changing, and then all of a sudden there's a defeat in the House of Lords. So your hope has been dashed by these people. So that could be a secondary reason. On a micro level, coming right the way down to Yeovil and Dorset, we had this Dorset by-election, which was this microcosm of reform, which was understood to be corrupt. And that led to rioting in Blandford and Sherborne, and that had an influence on what happened in Yeovil. So if you put all those things together, you might have the chance of a riot. Okay. This is the idea of criminals. So criminal convergences, they were all criminals. They all joined together and they looted and stole things. That's what a riot's all about. Well, unfortunately, when you look at our sample, you don't see that. Where are all these criminal gangs that are behind all this? Why haven't they been arrested? In fact, you might expect criminals to be arrested first in a riot, wouldn't you? Because the authorities know who they are. So the figures should be biased. The arrestees should be biased towards people who are known by the authorities already. They certainly were in 2011, when most of the people picked up already had criminal records. Surprise, surprise. Because you need to have a photograph, don't you, if you're going to catch people. So our writers are not criminals. They don't seem to have a serious criminal past, despite the draconian legal conditions. And interestingly, there was very little looting. I mean, these criminals, surely they want to avoid the Yeomanry, avoid the special constables, and steal things. Well, that's not what happens, is it? So if there's a bunch of criminals, they don't act like criminals, and they weren't criminals. So that idea falls apart. This idea, this is the French sociologist stuff, indiscriminate, mindless behaviour. You lose your mind when you join a crowd. So not the French sociologist, of course, he doesn't lose his mind. But all you lot, if you put yourselves in a crowd like today, you're going to lose your minds. Because you'll be inspired by some feral instinct to go, anyway. So the point is, behind you all, the moment we take law away, you're human beings, the French sociologist said in the 1890s, take control away from you lot, and you become feral beasts who will do anything, indiscriminate violence, right? Well, nah. Not really, is it? I mean, first of all, if you did think this was a feral crowd, it was making very selectively targeted decisions, wasn't it? So it wasn't random, was it? It wasn't a mindless attack or use of violence, was it? They were very, very discriminating in what they attacked, to the point where they went, sorry mate, got the wrong house, it's your brother's, we'll stop. So they were discriminating, and they weren't mindless. So yeah, the overall crowd selectively targeted the houses rather than the person. So this is interesting as well, it's limits on behaviour. So the state might have been willing to hang any people, but the rioters weren't interested in hurting or killing anybody unless they were attacked or confronted by armed people like the Yeomanry. So we see limits, and where you see limits to behaviour, then you see rationality from the perspective of the crowd. What's acceptable, what's legitimate. So that's something to think about when you look at riots. And another thing is, when there's a riot tomorrow, or somewhere, you'll read about it, could be anywhere, have a look at what the rioters don't attack. What they don't attack rather than what they do. Because that will also tell you something about their limits, or what they regard as legitimate targeting. Takes two to tango, as my hero Fred Hampton once said. And what this is about the relationship between the crowd and the authorities. Okay, so I can tell you, certainly in Britain, there's been an advance in policing. It's taken a long time, but the police now recognise in this country that how they intervene in a disorder, what they might call a disorder or a protest or whatever they want to call it, a crowd event, a football thing particularly, football's changed a lot, and part of that's down to policing. They now recognise they're part of the equation. And even in the 1830s they knew that. So in the 1830s the authorities knew that if they did certain things, it might lead to escalation. And that's not what you're after, is it? You want to de-escalate the event. You don't want to escalate it. So forcible intervention by the authorities might disperse a crowd, but it might also result in escalation. So the Yeovil magistrates were aware of this. It didn't mean they weren't going to make mistakes. But anyway, so it's about the relationship of the two things, not just what the crowd does, but what the authorities do as well. How you handle it, how do you use violence. Another concept goes back to the late 19th century in France as well, which is contagion. And you'll hear this used a lot these days. And in terms of rioting, it's been used historically as copycat rioting. So what that means is that you go home tonight and there's some footage on the television of rioting, and then you all go out and start rioting because it's an involuntary response, you see. Violence just spreads involuntarily. Well, clearly it doesn't spread involuntarily, because otherwise if there was a riot tomorrow, the whole country might riot, or loads of cities would riot. So the question is contagion, this idea of involuntary activity, the spread of rioting, is also quite incorrect. So and you can see that in this case, where in 1831, though some cities and towns in Britain had reform riots, most experienced non-violent mass protests. So we've looked at around 500 protests and disturbances and riots around the Reform Act in October, November, December 1831, and the vast majority are peaceful parades and meetings. Some are riots, and the question is, why did they turn into riots? And you can see this bunch down in Dorset is related to this election and the social conditions in Dorset. And finally, this concept of social identity, we talk about it a little bit on the display if you want to go and have a look, but what is social identity? Well, it's around the idea about why you might be in that crowd in the first place, why you're there, what you believe, what you share with the rest of the crowd, what belief about the issue you share. And it could also be, you can have multiple social identities. It could be that they wanted reform, or they understood that reform was going to be good for them, they perceived it like that, but also they were people who were friends and neighbours and workmates. But they were socially grouped together. They had a social identity through their everyday lives, which didn't, you know, they weren't necessarily up at Montacute House having a banquet, were they, these people? So they shared a view on reform and a series of repertoire of what they regarded as legitimate ways of protesting and punishing people who were stopping them getting reform. And that was their social identity, that's what determined it. So the descriptions of the crowd in Yeovil, a sample of arrestees, provide evidence that it was predominantly made up of artisans and labourers and their families. They shared a social identity which helped frame their idea of reform and thus defined their legitimate targets. So that's it. Questions? We can do